tell you about this. As South Africa reels from ongoing power cuts, our neighbours in Zimbabwe are also singing the blues amid escalating outages. There are reports of power cuts that last a full day. That's correct in some instances. The power utility in that country, the Zimbabwe Electricity Supply Authority, has blamed this on vandalism of its infrastructure. Sounds familiar. But experts say a lack of investment in renewable energy is the actual problem. We're now joined by advocate Fadzayi Mahere. She's the spokesperson of the main opposition in Zimbabwe, Citizens Coalition for Change. Fadzayi, always good to see you. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. What do we need to understand about the energy landscape in Zimbabwe?
Well, the starting point is that Zimbabwe is currently facing its worst power crisis in about 10 to 15 years. Before the power crisis, only 42% of Zimbabweans have access to electricity. So this is on a good day when everything is working, of which only 13% of rural communities have electricity. But as things stand today, Zimbabweans are facing rolling power outages where we have load shedding or power cuts for as long as 18, 22, and mostly 24 hours long. This is crippling industry. Even the health sector has been severely impacted, where mortuaries are rotting in hospitals, where dead bodies are rotting in hospitals, where health equipment cannot work. High dependency units have been all but closed because of the power crisis, and most Zimbabweans are living in darkness. And I think what's most disturbing for our energy landscape is the fact that, this government has known for many years that we've got a problem with our infrastructure. There hasn't been sufficient investment in the power infrastructure in Zimbabwe. The national grid is dilapidated, is mostly not working, and they've made no plan to invest in renewable energy. Whenever a solar project has been, mooted, the money has been looted by this ZANU-PF government. And we've also seen a situation where, not enough use has been made of our hydro electricity potential. And so Zimbabwe is currently on its knees, completely in the dark. And, their solution is, I think, what's most disturbing for most citizens. Today we've just received a report that 100 top government officials, including ministers, are going to have, solar packs installed at their houses for an inflated rate. 200%. So there's clearly no intention on their part to solve the power crisis. They just want to use taxpayer money, from the ordinary citizens to cushion themselves while the rest of the country just wallows in darkness. Extremely, extremely disappointing. But it's just a symptom of the continued governance crisis and failure to govern on the part of Mr. Mnangagwa's regime. It's only been incompetence, a lack of planning, corruption. That has been the story of the day. And obviously, this electricity crisis comes on the back of the fact that 49% of Zimbabweans already live in extreme poverty. We've got the highest food inflation rate in the world. We've got the highest inflation rate in the world, triple-digit inflation. And there's been simply no plan to improve the lives of the people.
Sure. So as officials are gifting themselves solar panels to cushion themselves, what is the everyday person on the ground saying? I mean, you talk about the number of people that are able to access electricity being very low on a daily basis, if it does even come on, and the socioeconomic conditions that are faced by people. In 2018, when Robert Mugabe left and Mnangagwa came into power, there was so much hope from some sectors of society, right? Even though some argued, old skin, old wine?
The ordinary Zimbabwean knows that Mr. Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF are not fit to govern. And, the daily struggle of the Zimbabwean is such that you wake up and there's no electricity. You can barely take a bath because a lot of people are trying to use water from a pump or a borehole, so you can't even power that. And then you go to work and you get to work and there's no power. On your way to work, none of the robots or traffic lights are working. You get to the office, you can't. And, meanwhile, you haven't had a proper meal to eat because you can't cook. There's no electricity. You haven't been able to iron your clothes. There's no electricity. You get to work, you can barely use your computer because there's no electricity, and you spend the day like that. You get home and there's still no electricity. Your children are having to do their homework using a candle. Just the other day at Zimbabwe's biggest university, the University of Zimbabwe, students had a blackout in the middle of an exam. So how do you expect that sort of a country to function? The power sometimes comes back, but it comes back at midnight, maybe for an hour, for 2 hours, and you wake up, and by that time you're already asleep. You barely had anything to eat because you can't cook, or you cooked using firewood. And then you go back, you wake up and you repeat. That's been the story of every Zimbabwean. And I think there's been huge frustration on the part of all Zimbabweans. And everyone really is looking for 2020, forward to 2023, an opportunity where citizens can really, express themselves and say that, look, we are sick and tired of the indignity that's coming with this. And I think what's most disappointing as well is the fact that there's been no explanation from the Minister of Energy. There's been nothing said by Mr. Mnangagwa as to what the ordinary citizen must do, what they're going to do to solve this power crisis. The only thing that we've heard, like I've just explained, is that they're gifting themselves solar panels. But the ordinary citizen, what happens to us? It really is a stark failure of leadership on the part of Mr. Mnangagwa's regime, and all the hope that was carried by citizens maybe in 2017, 2018 when Mr. Mugabe left has all been wiped away. Every citizen can see that this is a regime that's actually worse than Mr. Mugabe. They have no intention whatsoever to improve the lives of Zimbabwean people.
Yeah, it's also deeply, deeply disturbing, right? So you take a look at South Africa and you think what?
Well, we look at South Africa and we say, at least your government and the system respects you enough to at least make a plan around organizing and letting you know when load shedding will take place. They actually are thinking about and saying, look, which stages of load shedding are there? In Zimbabwe, it's completely arbitrary. You can go sometimes for 2 days without electricity, and then boom, in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. it comes. It comes for 15 minutes. You quickly try and charge your phone, and then you continue like that. So, at least in South Africa, I think the big difference is that there's at least an understanding that you are in the middle of a crisis. You don't see Mr. Ramaphosa in the midst of this crisis, shelling out money to his ministers to allow them to build their own solar packs. And it must be borne in mind that just a fortnight ago, these same ministers that were building solar panels for using taxpayer money were given a soft loan of $500,000 each. So you can see that Zimbabwe is not poor. It's poorly managed. There is no interest whatsoever in trying to solve the situation. And we've known for a long time that South Africa has a power crisis, so Eskom is not going to be able to export to us, but no plan was made. And, sometimes an excuse is given around Kariba Dam, and that excuse obviously cannot hold water, excuse the pun, because firstly, it's the same Kariba Dam that Zambia relies on, and yet they have the good sense to invest in Kafue Gorge power station, while our ministers completely slept on the job and made no plan whatsoever. Secondly, there's been not a single solar farm. Zimbabwe is a country where there's so much sunshine that really there has to be a huge investment in renewable energy, but you don't see that whatsoever. We don't have a single, solar farm that's being powered by this government, that's being spearheaded. We have not tapped into independent power producers, and so you see that all the solutions are very clear, and as the Citizens Coalition for Change, we've set out a 5-point plan as to how to solve this crisis. Firstly, there has to be an investment in renewable and sustainable energy. Secondly, we have to expand our power generation capacity. We have to ensure that we modernize our existing power plants and build new ones. Thirdly, we have to make more efficient and better use of our hydropower stations, make better use of our dams. And fourthly, we need to invest in more independent power producers. And then fifthly is really a governance, one. You cannot lose $2.2 billion to corruption every single year and then claim that you don't have money to finance the national grid. So you see that Zimbabwe really at its core needs new leaders who are ethical, who are competent, and who are prepared to put the welfare of the citizens first.
How then should we understand this conversation, right? Because then you also have some other leaders from the rest of the continent jumping on that bandwagon that sanctions should be lifted on Zimbabwe. Is Zimbabwe under sanctions, or are particular people, are these targeted sanctions towards a particular people? Because that narrative is used as an excuse for why Zimbabwe remains in the state that it is once Africa's breadbasket.
Well, the difficulty with the sanctions mantra is that the very same regime that complains that it cannot do anything because of sanctions is the same regime that invests in solar packs for bigwigs when everyone is facing an electricity crisis. It's the same regime that flies private jets to all these international conferences while failing to invest in our own, air infrastructure and our own air transport system. It's the same people who buy themselves loads and loads of cars, very expensive cars, while we can basically we have no public transport system in Zimbabwe. It's the same regime who, when they fall sick, they go abroad for healthcare and they can barely buy, decent beds in hospitals. There's no paracetamol, no medication. And it's the same government that's looted, 2.2 billion consistently every single year, according to the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. And so you see that sanctions is just a scapegoat. It's just a narrative that's put forward by Mr. Mnangagwa's government to excuse their failure to govern. And Mr. Mnangagwa has to be, emphasized that when he took over from Mr. Mugabe, through the coup, he was the first person to say that, look, we cannot be moaning about sanctions, that the whole sanctions mantra is an excuse. And the current spokesperson of ZANU-PF, Mr. Chris Mchangwa, actually said that if there's a regime that's failing to govern because of, and they use sanctions as an excuse, then they should let someone else go on. And so we express as citizens that very same message to them. If they're failing to govern and they continue to make excuses, they're the same people who are looting $100 million worth of gold every single month. Those people cannot say sanctions are a problem. They've just failed completely to govern Zimbabwe, and because they've failed and because they've got no plan to take the nation forward, they really should give someone else a chance, which is why 2023 is so important for the ordinary citizen. Zimbabweans are raring to go and they're so keen to register to vote so that for once we have a government that can put the citizens first.
I can hear how frustrated you are. Take heart. Fadzayi Mahere, thank you very much for availing yourself this morning.